UFOs, nanotechnology and genetical engineering, to name just a few of the incredible things that are investigated here on Discovery Science, and not forgetting things that go bump in the night.
During the Cold War, secret Nazi technology was used in Britain to build an advanced rocket plane designed to fly to the edge of space to hunt high-flying Russian bombers.
You could fly it, refuel it, so you could keep it up there, and then you had a rocket motor waiting to fire when you had a real, genuine target to go for. So the interception capability would have been fantastic.
But this revolutionary project would be sabotaged by a rival aircraft company.
It transpired that Lockheed had indeed, over the years, been offering bribes to local politicians in Europe and in Japan to buy their aircraft.
This is the story of the Saunders Roe SR-177, the last rocket fighter. In the 1950s, NATO had a big problem. There was no way to intercept the high-flying Russian bombers loaded with nuclear weapons.
One of the major needs for fighter aircraft in the 1950s was to get up to altitude as fast as possible.
This requirement would eventually become the complete re-equipment of NATO's European air forces with a single type of supersonic fighter. There was a fortune to be made. But first, a design would have to be found to intercept Russian bombers in a matter of only seconds.
The British and the Europeans were very interested in using rocket power to get up to altitude, because that gave you a big boost very, very quickly. Jet engines sometimes take a while to get up to speed. So the Europeans went for rockets.
Well, I don't think there was any option. If you wanted to achieve the interception target of a standing start to 60,000 feet in 2 or 3 minutes, there was no other way to go, because the air-breathing engine would be running out of performance fast.
The British revived Nazi technology that was born from the need to destroy Allied bombers. The way forward came from Alexander Lippisch and his Comet rocket fighter.
Alexander Lippisch is the genius behind the Comet. He fought for this concept of a rocket-powered fighter, but above all, he fought for the concept of the swept-back wing that would give it the aerodynamics that would actually make it fly perfectly at high speed.
Alexander Lippisch was born in Munich in 1894. After serving as an aerial photographer in the First World War, he became interested in aircraft designs. But defeated Germany had been banned from building military planes. So Lippisch became an expert in designing gliders. As a result, he began to experiment with strange swept and delta wing shapes. During World War II, he put these ideas to work, building a revolutionary new fighter, the rocket-powered Comet.
It was the first operational aircraft in Germany with swept wings. And secondly, it was tailless in its layout, in the sense that it had no horizontal elevators, but it had a vertical tail. Thirdly, of course, and most unusually, it had a rocket engine.
The ME-163 Comet had to be as light as possible. And this meant it had to jettison its wheels on takeoff and then land on a metal skid. Although the rocket gave a fantastic climb rate, the fuel could be very dangerous for the pilot.
The problems with the 163 were mainly associated with it having 2 very volatile fuels, which, if brought together, caused an instant explosion. If they leaked onto a person, they could actually cause melting of the human frame.
On occasion, comets returning from a flight would explode as the fumes from the spent fuel tanks ignited spontaneously. Despite these dangers, the Me-163 was the fastest aircraft of World War II. Its lightning speed hit-and-run attacks on bombers were devastating. However, a lucky Allied bomb hit on the Comet's only fuel factory meant it wouldn't fly for the rest of the war. The Japanese were so impressed, they built a copy of the Comet. It was called the Shusui. Fortunately, the war ended before a more advanced rocket plane was available to combat the high-flying US B-29 bombers. With the German defeat in 1945, the Allies scoured the land for secret Nazi technology and scientists. Alexander Lippisch went to Britain.
After the war, Lippisch found himself out of a job, and originally he gravitated to England to work in Wimbledon, but the English really didn't know what to do with the German aviation designers. And Lippisch was quickly snapped up by the Americans, and in 1946 went off to work for the Convair Company in America.
I never met Lippisch in Germany at the end of the war, but I met him later in America. And it was obvious he was a man who believed in his own gifts in this area, and indeed he was gifted, because there's no doubt about it. The 163, apart from its revolutionary aspects, was a delightful airplane to fly.
The attraction of the Me-163 Comet was not limited to its flying ability, but more importantly, to its design. A feature of which the British would use to fly higher and faster than ever before. The 1940s Britain kept searching for the answer to develop its advanced jet aircraft program. The solution came from Nazi Germany's rocket-powered Me-163 Comet.
I think when we talk about the 163, one of the difficulties faced with the pilots in this time flying an aircraft of this caliber was it was taking them into a region, an almost unknown region of transonic flight.
The British took the wings of the Comet and attached them to the body of one of their existing jet fighters, the de Havilland Vampire. This new aircraft was called the Swallow.
The Swallow was an experimental aircraft. It wasn't a fighter aircraft. It was an experimental aircraft designed to try and breach the sound barrier.
But without Lippisch, the British lacked detailed knowledge of how to fly with the new swept wings. The result was disaster.
It was a touchy aircraft. I believed it was a potentially lethal aircraft.
In September 1946, while attempting a near supersonic test dive low over the estuary of the River Thames, the first Swallow broke up in mid-air. It was being flown by the legendary test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland. He was killed instantly.
He was at 7,000 feet, doing a Mach number of 0.875, when the aircraft suddenly disintegrated. Subsequently, a second high-speed 108 was built.
Eric Brown was sent up in the second Swallow to repeat de Havilland's fatal flight. Had the Swallow's poor flying characteristics been cured?
Well, I started this accident investigation trying to simulate the same conditions, when suddenly, without any warning, I had what is called a runaway divergent longitudinal oscillation. Now, what this means is that the aircraft has taken over control of itself and is oscillating violently. If you try and chase this motion, all you will do is aggravate it. So you just have to hope that you're doing the right thing. And it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. But very frightening. We had a camera in the cockpit photographing my head, and one's head is being thrown forward so your chin is striking your chest, and then thrown back violently against the headrest. And we think this is explained how Jeffrey was killed. I'm not very tall, whereas he was well over 6 feet, and we think his head struck the canopy and probably broke his neck.
The Swallow turned out to be a disaster, a flying coffin. And it's down to the fact that the British really didn't know how to use swept-back wings. They'd taken Lippish's idea, but they hadn't taken Lippisch. As a result, the aircraft they designed was very hard to control, and most of them crashed and killed their pilots.
Britain had lost the supersonic race. On October the 14th, 1947, the American Chuck Yeager became the first man to shatter the sound barrier. Flying a rocket-powered Bell X-1 launched in mid-air from a B-29 bomber. The 4 rocket motors of the X-1 were developments of the rocket engines in the original Me-163 Comet.
The very upsetting thing about the fact that we did not reach supersonic speed first was the fact that we had it in our grasp and we gave it away.
But the British hadn't finished with the legacy of the Messerschmitt Comet. With the onset of the Korean War in the 1950s, the British and Europeans returned to the problem of high-speed interception of Russian bombers.
One of the problems of early jet engines was that you could not accelerate quickly. It took a long while to build up to speed. This was largely because the materials the jet engines were originally built for just couldn't take the hot gases. So you had to very gently work up speed, which is no good if you're an interceptor fighter and want to get into battle quickly.
The rocket still seemed a better alternative for fast, high-altitude flight.
Because of the speed limitations and acceleration limitations in early jet engines, there was a feeling, particularly amongst British engineers, that there was still a space for the pure rocket engine, which didn't have some of these drawbacks. That if you used rockets, you could get the kind of speed and altitude that the jet engine at that period wasn't able to achieve.
When the Korean War started in 1950, the British Royal Air Force was still equipped with obsolete World War II fighters and slow jets. It now demanded a pure rocket aeroplane interceptor to kill the Russian bombers. A fighter like the original Me-163, but with substantially more fuel.
We realized that the Comet was, in its own way ahead of its time in the war. And although its application was limited, that was due to the fact that the rocket fuel was used so quickly. But its flying characteristics had tremendous potential.
Rocket-powered aircraft have 2 fundamental problems. The first is you need an awful lot of fuel. Rocket motors gobble up fuel at a huge rate. Just think of a Saturn rocket flying to the moon. It's just one giant fuel tank. So it's often very difficult to build an aircraft that could carry enough fuel that would make a rocket work for a proper length of time. The other difficulty, of course, is rocket fuel is very dangerous, so there are hazards for the pilot.
But the first designs suffered from the same defect as the original Comet. The rocket motor would burn up fuel too fast. Every possible corner of the aircraft would be filled with volatile rocket fuel. Even then, calculations showed the range would still be too short. And pilots were also less than enthusiastic about the idea of gliding home like the old Me-163 and landing a plane full of explosive fumes. This problem of how to get optimum performance from a very limited load of rocket fuel, and then fly safely with a powered landing was a major stumbling block for the British designers. But in the early 1950s, a breakthrough was made. The solution was simple, but it was ingenious.
We talked about an aeroplane that had a rocket motor only and came back what we call dead stick as a glider. And I think all the interested parties realized that this was not the way to go in what might be a long peacetime situation. We've all said we must put an additional power unit on board, not only to bring it back home, but to drive the hydraulics and the electrics and keep the weapon systems alive.
And so, the mixed power aircraft was born, flying with a jet for takeoff and a rocket motor for speed.
The mixed power solution solves the problem for a 1940s, 1950s designer of the drawbacks of the jet engine and the rocket engine. You have the jet engine, which though slow, enables you to land and take off safely. You have the rocket engine. Its problem was a lack of fuel, but where you use up most of the fuel is takeoff and landing, so you're doing that with the jet, and you can conserve your rocket fuel for combat.
The British now opted for mixed power in their new fighter. The company chosen to build the aircraft was called Saunders Roe. They were based on the English Channel coast near Southampton, where the winner of the pre-war Schneider Trophy had been built. This was the Supermarine S6, forerunner of the famous Spitfire fighter. Saunders Roe specialized in aircraft that could take off and land on water. These included the incredible Princess, the biggest flying boat ever built, bigger even than Howard Hughes's Spruce Goose. The Princess was powered by 10 engines.
I was the chief flight engineer on the Princess, responsible for all the machinery on board, and in particular for the fuel systems, the 10 engines, the 10 Proteus engines. It was very smooth indeed. I mean, the engines were way down the wing, and they were propeller turbines, so most of the cockpit noise in those days came from avionics systems, all of which had rotary converters in them, long before solid state. So the cockpit noise, which was a bit unpleasant at times, was mostly generated by air conditioning and avionics systems.
Saunders Roe got into the fighter business in a fascinating way. The end of World War II, Japan is still to be defeated. Japan is still holding out on a whole series of Pacific islands. The British decided that if they built a jet fighter that could operate off the water, then they could use it to capture these islands and use these islands for bases. So the British conceived this idea of a jet-powered fighter flying boat. And since Saunders Roe were good at building flying boats, that's who got the job.
It was called the SR-A1, or the Squirt.
It was big for a fighter, but it had good performance. It had 2 axial flow engines and well armed, maneuverable. It had everything, in fact, that you could expect from such a design.
The war ended before the Squirt was ready. Despite its ugly shape, the Squirt could reach high speeds of Mach 0.8.
The SR-A1 was on its test programs out of Cowes Harbour when I joined the company, but it was being handled by a small team all on its own.
Their leader was an aeronautical design genius by the name of Maurice Brennan.
I worked for Maurice Brennan on the design side. He was the chief designer, and he was a youngish gentleman with a lot of brains. He was sometimes fairly hard work to work with, but it never really meant any harm. And he certainly took decisions smartly and effectively and told us what we were supposed to be doing. And I think he was outstanding in his way at that time. There was nobody quite like him.
Brennan now turned his attention to the task of building a fighter powered by a combination of rocket and jet motors. The new Saunders Roe project was called the SR-53.
The SR-53 was essentially a prototype for an effective mixed power plant jet and rocket fighter. So the brief was, can we find a small enough jet engine that will do the job of landing and takeoff without burdening the plane when it's in rocket-powered combat? Can we find an effective rocket motor that will work under combat conditions? Can we find a way of wrapping this in a missile platform that can carry missiles that can take down the bombers? So it was a test bed for an actual combat fighter.
The SR-53 carried 2 engines. Above was a tiny jet engine called the Viper. Below was a liquid-fueled rocket motor, the de Havilland Spectre. This was the main combat power plant. But the British had made a breakthrough with the Spectre, solving the dangerous fuel problems that had made the Messerschmitt Comet dangerous to fly.
The Spectre 1A rocket motor had catalyst packs in it, made up of gauze which had been silver-plated. And the silver turned the peroxide instantly into superheated steam and oxygen. Now, the Germans had used a liquid catalyst, and if they had an accident of any kind and the two fluids, HTP and their liquid catalyst, got together, they blew the aeroplane up. So we had a dormant catalyst system inside the engine itself, and it was much safer that way than the way the Germans had done it.
The SR-53 had another revolutionary feature. The tail surface was a delta shape mounted high on the tail fin, rather than on the sides of the aircraft.
I think other people were beginning to copy it as an invention, and certainly we simply adopted it as the best technique for our aeroplane and went ahead with it.
The SR-53 weighed nearly 7,000 kilos, and the tiny wings spanned 8 meters. It was armed only with missiles, 2 de Havilland Firestreak infrared-guided air-to-air missiles on the wingtips.
The SR-53 was one of the first of the 50s and 60s generation of aircraft that dispensed with guns. It was all missile-armed.
The prototype SR-53, serial number XD-145, was first flown on the 16th of May, 1957.
We were all getting ready to go to the Farnborough show in 57, I think it was, and we obviously had a lot of pressure on us politically to get something done. So we produced the aeroplane fairly quickly with only 2 tanks of HTP, and John Booth was the test pilot of the day, and he made a very, very successful first flight out of Boscombe Down, landing back on, using the Viper, of course, for the approach and landing. And so everything functioned superbly on day 1.
But events in Russia were now to play a part. By the mid-1950s, Western intelligence was reporting that the Soviets were working on a new generation of high-flying supersonic bombers. Aircraft that could reach an altitude of 16 kilometers, or twice the height of Mount Everest, and cruise at Mach 1.3, or 1,600 kilometers per hour. Aircraft like the mighty Myasishchev M50, NATO codename Bounder. The existing Allied fighter projects were not capable of dealing with this development. Not even the SR-53, which lacked AI or interception radar to find the faster Russian planes. The SR-53 had to sacrifice weight in order to get its phenomenal rate of climb. The solution to this dilemma would become known as the SR-177 rocket fighter. At the height of the Cold War, with Russian bombers cruising the stratosphere, only the British knew how they could be shot from the skies. By using the SR-177 rocket fighter.
Well, I think the SR-177 was a product of Maurice Brennan's thinking, because we all knew that without AI radar in the front of the aeroplane, you couldn't hope to find a Russian at 60,000 feet. So something had to be done to make the rocket-powered interceptor into a proper interceptor. And without the AI radar, nobody could believe that the SR-53 would ever find a target.
The SR-53 program was to continue, but as a test bed for the SR-177. The new design combined the basic wing and tail design of its lightweight predecessor with a bigger fuselage and engines. The turbojet was called the Jaron Junior, optimized for supersonic speeds.
With the reheat, you had a tremendous climb performance, and you could put your aeroplane up at 30 or 40,000 feet in its own right. You could fly it, refuel it, so you could keep it up there, and then you had a rocket motor waiting to fire when you had a real, genuine target to go for. So the interception capability would have been fantastic.
The wings were substantially larger and incorporated special flaps for maneuverability in combat. But Saunders Roe stuck with the same Spectre rocket used in the SR-53. A bigger rocket would have needed more dangerous and volatile fuels.
The SR-177 was commissioned essentially as a bigger SR-53, an aircraft that had all the control abilities and speed of the SR-53, but could carry enough fuel to make it a serious contender when it came to combat. It had a jet engine, but by this time, in the late 50s, it was quite a powerful jet engine to allow it to take off and land conventionally, and it also had the big rocket motor that would allow it to zoom to altitude very quickly.
Main thing was that it had full radar interception capability. It had flight refueling for the kerosene system and was therefore capable of being put up and kept up until it was wanted. So it had vastly more flexibility and interception capability.
In West Germany, the newly reconstituted Luftwaffe, whose officers and leaders had fought against the RAF and Allies in World War II, now had other priorities. How to meet and counter the threat of Soviet bombers and fighter bases that were only a few minutes away in East Germany. Interceptors taking off would have only seconds to shoot down the attacking Soviet aircraft. So the decision was taken: West Germany would buy the SR-177 rocket fighter.
The Germans certainly were very interested in it, and a very senior member of their German Air Force came to Boscombe Down and actually sat in the SR-53 in the hangar when I was explaining to him how it worked. And we pointed out to him that he was sitting in an airplane which at that time was ready to fly because it was full of peroxide.
Germany began negotiations to build its own version of the SR-177. The German company chosen to manufacture it was Heinkel, manufacturer of the World War II HE-111 bomber. But the Heinkel company had also built the world's first rocket-powered aircraft, the HE-176, in 1939. With the prospect that the SR-177 could equip much of NATO, the United States backed the development of the program with funding.
There was a thing called the Mutual Weapons Development Program, MWDP, and unknown to most of us, the Americans were putting quite a lot of money into British airplanes, and it was not unusual for them to be asked to put some money into something as advanced as the 177.
By 1957, 70% of the production tooling was in place to manufacture the first SR-177.
A prototype of the SR-177 was actually being constructed at Cowes, and we already had a full-scale mock-up of the aeroplane. So we were fairly well committed to proceeding with the design.
The first flight was planned for the spring of 1958. The production version would be 16 meters long. Maximum speed would be Mach 2.35. It was planned to put the SR 177 into service in 1960. Meanwhile, the SR-53 program continued as a way of gathering experience in rocket fighter combat. But storm clouds were gathering over the British rocket fighter. Suddenly, Britain was about to discover she was no longer a major power. In 1956, Britain, along with France and Israel, invaded Suez in an attempt to recapture the canal from the Egyptians. The result was a diplomatic disaster. Soviet Premier Khrushchev made veiled threats of nuclear war, while America's President Eisenhower, Britain's old wartime ally, made moves to cut off economic and military aid. The debacle had a dire effect on the SR-177 program. In the Suez Crisis aftermath, Britain's Defense Secretary Duncan Sandys had tough choices to make as he planned Britain's new defense strategy. The country was broke and could not afford its military upkeep, let alone expensive and exotic new warplanes. And after the 1957 launch of Sputnik, the world was now under possible threat from nuclear missiles. The result was a 1957 white paper. Garrisons would be closed around the world and battleships scrapped as Britain based its defense on nuclear weapons. Also, pilots and planes would be replaced by surface-to-air missiles, such as the Bloodhound.
Well, the Sandys policy, I think, had the inevitable reaction of lowering the morale of the pilots, operational pilots, considerably. What I've seen of missiles, their reliability, particularly in the time scale we're talking of, left quite a bit to be desired. And that certainly worried me about the whole thing. I thought, really, this is no way to replace the pilot's brain power with a computer-guided missile.
In 1957, it seemed as though the SR-177 rocket fighter would never fly. However, the British Royal Navy now came to its defense to protect its new carriers.
Well, the Navy took an interest in rocket power, not so much as a pure rocket aeroplane in the sense that the Me-163 was, but if you like, as a combat booster, power booster, to give you the extra speed when you need it.
The order for the naval version of the SR-177 was renewed, and 18 prototypes were ordered. And there were other possible markets. The SR-177 was still ideal for the fledgling Luftwaffe in Germany.
They were very interested. I think they were surprised that we had got so far as we had, and they were obviously presumably involved with the NATO concept of the Russians. So we all needed the same sort of interception performance to keep the Russians out of the act.
The British now approached the US government for special NATO cash to develop the aircraft and build the first prototypes. The SR-177 might still fly. But now, the SR-177 faced a new foe. It was an American aircraft called the Missile with a Man in It, and it would be a duel to the death. The competition was hotting up, and things were getting more and more uncertain for the SR-177. At stake was the chance to replace the huge numbers of aging Sabre and Thunderstreak aircraft. Whoever got this job would make a killing. But who would win this lucrative prize? Saunders-Roe or the latecomer, Lockheed?
The principal competitor to any European aircraft fulfilling the role as NATO's main interceptor fighter was the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter.
The Starfighter had its origin in a November 1952 unsolicited proposal by Lockheed's Clarence L. Kelly Johnson for a lightweight and relatively unsophisticated air superiority fighter. But the Lockheed Starfighter was not really well suited to the needs of the US Air Force. It had a short range, and its stubby wings could carry little in the way of bombs and missiles. In addition, the Starfighter lacked true all-weather capability, which made it incapable of operating in conjunction with America's defensive radar system.
One of the great curiosities of the whole Starfighter story is that the United States Air Force didn't want it. They didn't like it because it really didn't fit their bill. It didn't have range, it didn't carry enough armament, it didn't carry the radar they wanted. So Lockheed suddenly found itself a product it couldn't sell in America.
The American Air Force preferred the delta-winged Convair F-102 and F-106 fighters, designed with the help of none other than Dr. Alexander Lippisch, inventor of the Me-163 Comet. By the late 1950s, the Lockheed Starfighter seemed doomed to be only a relatively minor footnote in the history of military aviation. A desperate Lockheed now offered the Starfighter to West Germany and NATO in competition with the SR-177. This was a paper project called the F-104G, G standing for Germany. But to suit the Germans, Lockheed were forced to promise to radically modify the F-104.
In order to make the Starfighter suitable for European conditions, Lockheed had to do lots of things that actually detracted from all the original advantages the aircraft had. They had to put more fuel in, which made it heavier, which made it more difficult to control. They had to put in a very complex all-weather radar so they could see where it was going. In the end, the thing becomes heavy, complicated, and that makes it dangerous to fly.
It had very high wing loadings, and consequently it had very high stalling speeds and other problems. But it wasn't in the same league table as a rocket-powered aeroplane when it came to high-altitude interceptions.
The first sign that the Americans were going to play hardball over the orders for the new NATO joint fighter was when they refused the British request for funds to build the SR-177 prototypes. They wanted to get rid of any competitors for the Starfighter. With the loss of American funding, the British now cancelled the vital orders for the SR-177 for the Royal Navy. But Saunders-Roe struggled to keep the rocket fighter idea alive. On the 15th of May 1958, an SR-53 went supersonic for the first time, proving the bigger SR-177 was still a contender for the deal of the century.
We used to go supersonic out of Boscombe Down in the direction of Bournemouth, Lyme Bay, and we were usually supersonic in the climb all the way up. And I seem to remember a figure of rate of climb of 45,000 feet a minute.
Yet, 5 months later, on November the 6th, 1958, came a shock. The Lockheed Starfighter was declared the winner of the NATO contest. The announcement was made by the German Federal Defense Minister, Franz Josef Strauss, in Bonn. Even in Germany, experts were surprised.
I was training the German Naval Air Arm in Germany at the time when they decided they needed a change of aircraft. and the aircraft chosen by the Luftwaffe was the F-104. And for the sake of standardization, it was imposed on the German Naval Air Arm. I certainly did not believe that was the right aircraft for them.
Despite this, Germany ordered 66 F-104s from Lockheed and made plans to build 210 more in Germany itself. Other NATO nations followed to eventually produce 1,700 starfighters. Lockheed had made a fortune, the details of which would not come out for another 20 years.
After the Watergate scandal of the 1970s and the downfall of Richard Nixon, there were major congressional investigations into illegal campaign funds to Nixon. And at that point, it transpired that Lockheed had indeed, over the years, been offering bribes to local politicians in Europe and in Japan to buy their aircraft. So I think the inference must be that the Starfighter ended up as the major NATO fighter for reasons other than its technical capabilities.
Lockheed admitted that over time, it had paid out some $22 million in sales commissions to bribe foreign government officials to buy its aircraft. This included bribes paid out to officials in West Germany. The resulting fallout led to President Jimmy Carter passing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act on December the 19th, 1977. But the consequences were not limited to mere politics. In the uncertain days of the Cold War, the unlikely winner in the competition to rearm NATO's air forces was the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. Aside from future allegations and admissions of bribery and corruption, the decision to buy the F-104 was marred by real human tragedy, resulting in disaster. 270 Luftwaffe planes lost and 110 pilots killed.
It proved to be an extraordinarily difficult aircraft to fly, and literally the majority of aircraft the Germans bought, literally the majority of F-104s, crashed in service because the young pilots simply found them too difficult to fly.
With unbearable numbers of young Luftwaffe pilots dying in starfighters, the German government's decision to buy the F-104 was called into question. However, criticisms were not tolerated, and to silence opponents, dissenting voices were removed from office.
It is not an easy airplane for an experienced pilot in bad weather, and it's even more of a handful if you have an emergency and you have bad weather and everything combined. It can be a real handful, a big workload. And of course the inevitable happened.
There is one last secret about the German rocket fighter. Having cancelled the SR-177 and bought the all-jet Starfighter, the Luftwaffe was still worried about the possible vulnerability of its airfields to Warsaw Pact attacks. Under contract from the Luftwaffe, Lockheed was instructed to carry out secret tests with the Starfighter launched by a rocket booster. A Luftwaffe Starfighter was modified for a series of launch tests in 1963 at Edwards Air Force Base in California. With the end of the dream of the SR-177, the British made one last effort to keep their rocket plane program alive. In America, the rocket-powered Bell X-15 was now flying to the very edge of space. The X-15, a linear descendant of Yeager's X-1 that first broke the sound barrier in 1947, and further back to the Me-163 Comet, was to become the fastest aircraft that has ever flown. In Britain, it was decided to keep the SR-53 flying and use it for high-altitude space research, a British X-15.
Well, I know that our chief designer in those days, Maurice Brennan, was keen to pile on the SR-53 off the back of a Valiant bomber and to launch it into space. And I remember him saying that it would be the bottom rung of the British space program. But the British space program never materialized, so of course any attempts to do high-altitude research with what was left of the SR-53 program never happened.
Now, a fatal tragedy was to strike what was left of the British rocket plane project.
John Booth was flying XD-151 on the short runway at Boscombe Down when, for whatever reason, he wanted to abandon the takeoff. Now, the takeoff speed of the 53 was about 175 knots. And in those days, there was no arrestor gear, either barriers or any other form of arrestor gear, at Boscombe Down. So the aeroplane went off the end of the runway and down the slope. He spoke quite casually over the radio that he wanted to abandon and would send the tractor down to collect him, but of course it proved to be fatal.
The SR-53 hit a row of telegraph poles, killing Booth instantly. After the crash, the SR-53 test program was shut down. The rocket fighter had flown for the last time.
The SR-177 was a good aircraft for its time and place. Had it been built and flown, I think it would have done well. But of course, history moved on. Ordinary jet engines in the 1960s and 1970s became much more efficient and eventually replaced the rocket engine. But at the time, I think it could have done well. I don't think there will ever be another rocket fighter.
The last remaining SR-53, testimony of a lost dream, lies in the Museum of the British Royal Air Force in Cosford, England. Its big brother, the SR-177, has been forgotten by history. Another of the planes that never flew.